Good afternoon, everybody. I know folks are still joining us, but we've got a good sized crowd today. So welcome to everybody, and we'll kick ourselves off here. My name's Jim Farney. I'm director of the Regina campus of the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy, and I'm very happy to moderate this afternoon's chat. And I'll introduce our speakers in a second. JSGS is a national hub for research in public policy and administration. So this topic of inclusivity is kind of very close to what we aim to do. We're a partnership between the U of R and the U of S, and we've really tried to work and embed that spirit of collaboration and cooperation over our 15 years. So I'm very happy to have two colleagues from business schools today joining us. This time, I'd like to acknowledge that the event's taking place on Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 in a way, since we've got some Regina and some Saskatoon people. That means that we're cognizant that we're on the traditional homelands of the Métis, the Saulteaux, the Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and the traditional homeland of the Métis. Recognizing this is not simply a recognition. It's core to our future as a school, and finding ways to work towards reconciliation is, I think, crucial for our mission. For those of you who haven't been able to take part in previous parts of this series, welcome. It's an ongoing series of lectures that we've designed to kind of highlight topics of EDI and indigeneity in today's public sector. And we're very pleased that it's supported by the Max Bell Foundation that is really focused on a wide range of forward-looking innovations in the delivery of public services, but has really chosen to partner with us on issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion. So thank you to their support. I know there's going to be some info going up in the chat. Today, in particular, we want to focus on kind of a little bit of the how. Let's get past just counting folks and talk about the how we can have more inclusive leadership styles, build more inclusive organizations. In terms of format, each of our speakers, we'd started off and said that Laura Lee and Gina would talk for 10 minutes. We've settled on 13. It was a difficult negotiation. So they'll lead us off with some conversation. Then we'll engage in kind of an armchair stat style for the rest of our time together. I'd ask you to put your questions to the speakers into the chat, and I'll kind of moderate. I'll pull the neat stuff out of the chat if I can. We've got over 200 folks on the call, so I may do some lumping of questions together, but please don't hesitate to put things up there. If there are any logistical things that pop up, please drop a message to Karen Jaster-LaForge, the staff member who's supporting us today, at jsgs.events@uregina.ca. If for some reason you drop off the call, Karen's keeping an eye on the waiting room, so just log back in. We are recording this lecture and it'll be available later on our website. So by way of introduction, I'm very happy to have the two folks with us today who are with us, in part because I think on many of these types of issues, it's great to reach out and look for different sources of expertise. And, both business schools in Saskatchewan have developed that. So I'm pleased to have a representative of each as a partner. Dr. Gina Grandy is a professor of business and leadership here at the U of R, and is dean of the Hill and Levene Schools of Business, as well as lead of the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub in Saskatchewan. Her research, and I've got to say, working with her as an administrator, much of her administration focuses on women in leadership and the experiences of women and stigmatized groups. And she's been quite active in the community as well on those topics. Laura Lee Nicol is a faculty lecturer in the Edwards School of Business, where her primary teaching has been on ethics and strategic decision-making. She's a member of the Edwards EDI Collective and a champion, which is a university designation, if I remember right, of EDI at USask. In the community, she currently serves as the board chair for the Global Gathering Place, which is a newcomer settlement agency in Saskatoon. So welcome to you both. I'm really excited to have you here to share your experiences and your knowledge. And I'll turn the floor over to Dr. Grandy to start.
Thanks so much, Jim, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today. It is a pleasure. For the first part of our conversation, my focus will be on how we can move beyond addressing diversity to include equity and inclusion and the leadership practices that can support that, or some of the leadership practices. Many of my examples will be specific to women, given my own areas of research and expertise, and I won't claim that the practices that I talk about are kind of, it's a one size fits all, but I think many of them can be applied more broadly when we look across a variety of how we might better support and move to inclusive cultures for designated equity deserving groups. My intent is not to discuss the business case for equity, diversity, and inclusion. There's plenty of research that already concludes that. I hope we're well beyond that, although of course I also know part of me knows that I suspect we're not. Ultimately, I stepped forward to be considered for a leadership role, in large part because I teach and preach the importance that numbers matter. We do need to see more women in leadership roles so that other women can see new career paths for them. And I wanted to be a part of creating those opportunities for others. I only considered it as a path for me, however, because several women and men leaders provided me with sponsorship support. They saw something in me that I didn't see in myself, and they were willing to put their necks out for me because they believed in me and helped create opportunities. So I do want to be clear. I believe that numbers matter. Representation matters, but it isn't enough. I would argue our focus to date has really been on representation, representative bureaucracy, so that a public institution's workforce should reflect the makeup of its constituents in its surrounding communities, and that it values diversity to better respond to the diverse needs in the general population. This approach has seen some success, and generally it's had better success in the public sector than the private sector, but we still have a long way to go. I'm happy to speak about that progress and the gaps that still exist from a representative bureaucracy perspective in the moderated conversation if people are interested in that. I want to direct our attention now, though, to starting a conversation on how representation isn't enough, and what we as leaders in the public sector can do about it through our leadership practices. For context, for me, diversity means ensuring people from a range of backgrounds are participating in all levels of work. So in many regards, kind of that representation aspect. Equity, that different people and groups will require different kinds of support in order to access the same opportunities. And inclusion, that not only is there diversity in the workforce, barriers to participation are removed, and there is a sense of belonging, and also that uniqueness is valued. For many reasons, diversity does not necessarily mean inclusivity or inclusive cultures. The inclusive leadership practices that I speak to relate more to equity and inclusion rather than diversity in regards to moving the dial on EDI and public sector organizations. Inclusive leadership practices are those which foster both a sense of belonging, where people feel they are a part of a group and their perspective is valued, but also uniqueness, so that their contributions do not mean they have to suppress or give up their individuality in order to be part of the group. I'm going to frame the practices in forms of questions. So I'll start with this one. When did you last engage in a listening tour to hear what women or racialized women or those with a disability in your organization were experiencing or needed? As an ally, we can't necessarily speak and shouldn't speak for others. You need to ask and listen and build a culture where the leaders who surround you know that this is important to you so that they enact it as well. Listening tours, focus groups, employee surveys, working groups, there are a number of ways to be able to achieve this. As an academic, and for those who are on here that are also academics, we know that COVID has been particularly hard on women academics, especially those with small children. I work in a small enough context that either myself or the associate deans have a decent sense of who may be struggling. But what I can say is that knowing the associate deans around me, knowing that this is important to me and is important to them, they brought to my attention recently in regards to a couple of women academics and their circumstances. And as a result, we were better able to take some action to support them because they had been disproportionately negatively affected by COVID as it relates to childcare and limited family support. Now, I also want to make a note, though, I didn't necessarily assume that I knew what might help them. We thought a number of things, but a conversation happened with them to figure out if the support we were able to provide was really what they needed or would help them. How do you form teams? Who sits on what team? Do those teams function as inclusive sections and subunits of your organization? Consider the composition of the groups in your unit. And this can often slip by us because we think usually in technical expertise. So we need to pull the right people in to be able to accomplish or move forward on a project. And sometimes we can be blinded to our own privilege. It isn't lost on me that I identify as a white woman, and that comes with a certain privilege and perspective, and I can sometimes forget that. This also means that we sometimes have to slow down in order to achieve inclusion in groups and even set parameters for those groups to facilitate different perspectives being allowed to emerge and for them to be valued. Encouraging diverse perspectives and providing sufficient time for this can be challenging. And we have to train ourselves to allow various perspectives to emerge naturally and to not rush it. When are you scheduling meetings for those teams, or generally for critical discussions or last-minute meetings? I'd encourage all of us to think before we schedule meetings or we request meetings or have deadlines at short notice, without thinking about what other commitments people have. Are we placing people in a situation where, in effect, they have to ask for special permission because they can't meet those expectations because they have other responsibilities that mean they can't take the next 2 evenings to meet that deadline that we've imposed at last minute? Do you know the preferred pronoun of those who were closest to you? Do you use inclusive language, and do you pay attention to the use of pronouns? So as an example, what do you have in your signature line? And do you pay attention to the signature line of others, which give us clues often as to those preferred pronouns? Are you willing to invest more or differently in some people to make movement, meaningful movement on EDI? I believe we have to invest in individuals who represent one or more of the designated equity deserving groups, even if that means investing more or differently than across the workforce. But you do need to be prepared to justify that, and whether that's tying it to your strategic plan or the values of the organization. And that can be through investing in coaching, mentorship, leadership development. I'll give you a couple of examples. Senior executive who identifies as a man made it his practice to only, so someone I know locally, made it his practice to only formally mentor women, given the gap in women in leadership positions at the organization where he leads, and more broadly. I would say, though, if you do this, to be prepared to have to explain it, or at the very least know that some will question it as unfair. In my own institution and in my own faculty, we've invested in leadership coaching for women and racialized women in early career leadership positions. I believe I have a responsibility to do that, and I feel comfortable making that decision if I am challenged on it. That doesn't mean I wouldn't do it for men, but it is a function of where my attention is directed. Who is appointed for acting interim roles? And what is that process? Typically, Appointments for acting or interim roles are less transparent. Okay. And what I would argue is that these are critical opportunities for people to build their CVs, to prepare them for career progression. And so if we are actually just shoulder tapping someone and we're not thinking about who's getting that opportunity for those experiences, we are actually creating barriers to others in regards to them not only feeling included, but also them moving forward and having opportunities. When was the last time you sponsored a woman in your organization, or a racialized woman? And by sponsorship, what I mean is, when did you last recommend a woman to a special project that was high profile? When did you last create a connection between someone you know looking for a director and a woman with great leadership potential? One of the things you have to also prepare yourself for is that in sponsoring individuals, it does mean that you may also lose them to your organization. And what I would argue is the framing that is the notion that if we are really genuinely interested and committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion, that sponsorship is our responsibility. And it really is about helping create paths or facilitate paths for others. My hope is, of course, in doing that, as I've done on a number of occasions, that those people will pay it forward to others when they step into those roles. Are you holding leaders in your unit accountable to equity and inclusion? Articulate an expectation that leaders who report to you must live the values of the organization as it relates to equity and inclusion, so that they too sponsor and mentor someone who does not have the same background as they do, who does not, so to speak, look like them, and hold those leaders accountable in their annual reviews to report on that. And finally, are you willing to be brave enough to try, but also willing to be brave enough to accept responsibility when you don't get it right? Because you will not always get it right. We have to be willing to take a risk and learn from not getting it right. But we also need to remember to consult those for whom the equity inclusion efforts are intended to benefit. I have two stories or two quick examples I'd like to share. When I started early in the faculty where I am now, the dean at the time talked about a potential opportunity to create a woman executive in residence. The response from, I'll say, colleagues wasn't necessarily all that positive. Wondered why it had to be designated, thought it was going to put us backwards. And I remember uncomfortably having to speak out to say, I think this is a good idea. Every time I walk into a room, my gender stands out. And that if we didn't start doing something to name it, I didn't think that we would actually be able to make progress. Another example, over this past year, 2 years, we've started, or we're creating, an Indigenous Pathways program for students. I didn't lead on that. We had an individual, a faculty member who identifies as Indigenous, lead on that. We listened to, reached out to, connected with current students who were Indigenous, alumni who were Indigenous, to put forward a set of recommendations for my consideration and the leadership team. The last thing I will note, though, is we still do need to be cautious. And if we get to a chance, if someone's asking me perhaps mistakes I've made, is that I've recently been reminded that good intent is not good enough. So we do need to be careful and in making assumptions of speaking for others or assuming we know what other individuals might need or want. I'll end it there and I'll hand it over to Laura Lee.
Thanks, Gina. So many great things. I was taking notes as you were talking, so lots of great ideas coming out of there. And I'm going to continue to build on what Gina has already talked about in terms of the role of leaders in creating inclusive environments. But I'm going to focus a lot more on the personal element of that and those competencies or skills that leaders need to authentically embrace diversity and facilitate inclusion and belonging. So as Jim noted in my bio, I do teach strategy, ethics, and leadership at Edwards. And last February, I gave a presentation to our faculty as part of our Teaching and Learning Excellence Roundtable. And I called the presentation Escaping the Box, How Student Diversity Can Inspire Teaching Innovation. And I started my presentation with this quote: "Diversity brings us innovation, but only if we are open to it and we respect it." And I open with that quote because I think that often unconsciously we approach diversity as a problem to be solved rather than an opportunity to be pursued. And while many organizations are beginning to focus more intentionally on expanding representational diversity at a surface level, as Gina noted, below the surface, we often continue to perpetuate what I would call a conformity-oriented mindset. So we ask questions, and they're simple and they're fair questions. Questions like, how do we help our international students fit in? How do we help Indigenous colleagues adjust? How do we work around the accessibility and equity accommodation requests that come our way? These questions in and of themselves aren't inherently bad, or they're not mean-spirited. However, the sentiment underlying these statements is one of helping others to adjust or adapt to a preconceived standard or notion of conformity. But what if we start to view diversity as the desired norm? That's the healthy state. Diversity is the healthy state that we want to achieve. We know that nature needs diversity to thrive, and that natural ecosystems are threatened when diversity declines. So perhaps we are struggling in this space because we haven't learned to embrace diversity, or maybe we haven't managed to develop the mindset or the skill set to think and act differently when it comes to diversity. So I was reading an opinion piece by Nargis Karani in the Globe and Mail a few weeks ago, and I wrote this statement down because it struck me as really significant. She wrote, "True diversity is accepting and embracing individuals who are nothing like you." I think this sentiment really gets to the heart of EDI. It strikes me that as we hear more and more about these concepts, that we do run the risk of intellectualizing them to the extent that they become individually or personally meaningless. While there's certainly policies and processes and data collection and infrastructure elements that are necessary for creating holistic EDI ecosystems, I think it's important not to lose sight of the deeply personal, relational, and emotional implications and impacts. To actually see meaningful progress in this space, I think every single one of us needs to step back and consider what we think and why we think it. I think we need to honestly take a look at ourselves and consider how we show up in the world and how we relate to others who are different from us. So before I go into the competencies, I just want to acknowledge upfront that learning to navigate diversity and accept and embrace others who are different from us isn't easy. That said, people all over the world do it every day, so it is possible. So we know it is possible. But first, let's talk about some of the challenges, because if we don't understand the challenges, then it's hard to come up with some of the solutions. So Joshua Green writes in his book that biologically speaking, humans were designed for cooperation, but only with some people. So researchers from a variety of disciplines have found that interpersonal differences make it harder for people to connect and empathize with each other. So as humans, we instinctively gravitate towards others who are like us in things like age, in gender, in religion, in social class, in our occupations, and our education. Jonathan Haidt noted that we tend to trust and cooperate more readily with people who look and sound like us because we expect them to share our values and our norms. So we find comfort in associating with people who we perceive to be similar to us. And on the flip side, we consciously or unconsciously tend to fear or dislike or even act with hostility towards anyone or anything that we perceive to be foreign or unfamiliar. So while it sounds like the neuropsychological and biological cards are kind of stacked against us when it comes to EDI, we know that humans are amazing beings with incredible potential, and we do have the potential and the capability to rise above these innate tendencies. So we need to figure out how to do that. So researchers have found that the ability to navigate differences is a pro-social skill, and it's much like empathy or forgiveness. And while these, I would argue, are also very complex and challenging skills to develop, these are skills that can be fostered and deepened through intentionality and through knowledge and through practice. So here I'm gonna provide kind of 5 what I call integrated bundles of competencies because they are complex and they're interconnected. And these are ones that I focus on in my work with my students and also in my leadership consulting and coaching work. And I focus on them because I think that they are critical when it comes to becoming more aware of our biases, navigating these interpersonal differences, and helping individuals to become more authentically inclusive, as opposed to maybe just that surface level of inclusion that we've talked about. So the first kind of bundle is self-awareness and emotional regulation. And with this one, inclusive leaders are very aware of who they are and how they show up in the world. So it's important to learn to be able to step back and reflect on what you're thinking and feeling when it comes to navigating diverse relationships. And it's necessary to be able to connect those thoughts and feelings to your own values and beliefs, and then ultimately to your behaviors and your actions. So how do you respond when others don't think or act in the way that you think they should? How effective are you at managing your emotions? How do you act when you feel your worldviews are being challenged or threatened, or you feel frustrated or you're under stress? Self-awareness and emotional regulation are critical for creating inclusive environments. The second competency bundle is moral awareness and sensitivity. So how do you view equity, diversity, and inclusion? Do you see them as social and moral issues that are kind of out there? Or do you feel them more deeply and personally? Are they kind of internal or core moral imperatives for you? What about principles of fairness and justice and equality of opportunity? How important are those to you? How have your ethics and your values and beliefs been shaped by your upbringing, by your education, by your social context and other external factors? How much time have you spent thinking about your views about these things? And how do these views impact your relationships with others? The more we think about these things and the more we learn about them, the more aware we become of them in ourselves and in the world around us. The third bundle, social perceptiveness and empathy. So how in tune are you to the perspectives of others? Do you notice when people are being excluded? Do you think about how they might feel? Are you curious about what others think or believe? Have you made an effort to get to know people who aren't like you? Do you actively seek to understand cultures and belief systems other than your own? Social perceptiveness and empathy are prerequisites for inclusion. A speaker at a recent EDI conference that we had here at the U of S said, "Sometimes I feel like I'm not welcome in this world." How does a comment like that make you feel? What are you doing every day to ensure the people around you know that they are welcome, that they are valued, they are accepted, and they are respected? The fourth one, communication and collaboration. Gina touched on this already. How well do you listen? Do you listen with the intent to understand, or do you start thinking about what you're going to say and then wait impatiently until it's your turn to speak? Do you make space for the voices of others? Do you actively seek out the views and opinions of others? Do you create environments that invite diverse opinions and points of view? Do you structure your workplaces, your classrooms, your teams, and your departments in ways that facilitate pro-social forms of collaboration, or in a way that fosters relationally damaging forms of competition? How leaders model communication and collaboration is critical when it comes to shaping a culture that fosters inclusivity. And then finally, moral commitment and moral courage. Gina also talked about this one. How committed are you to proactively standing up for equity, diversity, and inclusion, and actively resisting prejudice, discrimination, and exclusion? Is being inclusive part of who you are, or part of who you're striving to be? Is it linked to your identity and to your integrity? Or do you view it as something that's being forced upon you as the latest flavor of the month, as I've heard people say? Do you speak out when you see acts of prejudice or discrimination taking place? Do you intentionally go into every interaction with a focus on inclusion and seeking to understand, accept, and embrace individuals who view and process the world very differently than you do? Or do you become defensive and maybe seek to diminish or disrespect or devalue their experiences, their perspectives, or beliefs? You know, it does take courage and humility and vulnerability to look inside ourselves and to consider our true thoughts on these things. There's a shadow world inside of us, and we know that, but shining a light into that shadow world is so key. So our answers to these questions, and I think our pursuit of answers to these questions, are critical in our quest to becoming authentically inclusive. So hopefully these gave you some things to think about and consider, and I'll turn it back over to Jim as we move into, I liked what you said, Jim. We're going to have an armchair style discussion. That's nice. Let's sit down by the fire and have this conversation.
It is that time of year. So yeah, please start putting your questions into the chat. I'd like though to ask Laura-Lee to expand on something that we talked about in our pre-call, and I found really powerful, but she didn't get to in her chat. And that is, you kind of, we didn't introduce you this way, but you have a whole previous life in kind of the medical system. And out of that, you talked about kind of the importance of having circles of support, if you know, in that context, for people with diverse abilities. And you'd kind of talked about how you might have to reframe leadership if you're interested in doing that. And I found that a really interesting how, and I wondered if you could kind of share that thought more broadly.
Yeah, for sure. Well, you only gave me 10 minutes to talk, so I can't give my whole life story in that 10 minutes, Jim. But now that you give me that opportunity, so I spent the first 17 years of my career as an occupational therapist, and I worked in healthcare, and I worked in education, and I worked in corrections, And then that's kind of when I went back, did my MBA, focusing on leadership, and started doing more in that space. And I'm back in school again, because, well, you just always have to keep learning, right? And so now I'm focusing on doing my doctorate, and I'm looking specifically at integrity development in our students. And so all these experiences, our experiences shape us, right? Like, and having that opportunity, excuse me, having that opportunity, I think, to work with individuals, you know, at various points in their life. You know, as an occupational therapist, you're often working with people, you know, at critical life-changing moments. You know, times when maybe their life has been turned upside down and they're looking at where do they fit? How do they belong? You know, what does life look like now? And I think that really shaped my views of inclusion and diversity, and what it takes to really engage people and show people the value, and come alongside people in those times. And I think that just has carried through everything I've done. And you know, I think that we can learn to thrive in lots of different environments and really tough environments, but we need people to come alongside us and do that. And I think that that's just a key role of leaders in this whole space. I don't know if that answered all your question, but maybe some of it.
It's good. It's good. Thank you. I'll go to a question from Charisse that I'll throw, I think, first to Gina, but I know you can both answer it. And that is kind of thinking about this in the context of formal organizations, right? So yes, we talk about EDI as a set of team practices and a set of kind of individual competencies, but we're also doing it, you know, within contexts where there's formal performance metrics and formal kind of incentive structures to kind of, you know, do that annual check-in. And Sharish is kind of asking, is there, you know, how do we think that piece through, right? Does it become just another subsection on the strat plan? Does it change how the rest of the strat plan looks like? Does it change the ways that we develop measures of performance for people? How do we think that piece through? Because we're trying to do this at scale.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's certainly a tough question. And I will say, in my own context, I can talk about examples of where we're doing some of that, but in others where, of course, hands are a bit tied and we're still trying to navigate through it. I would first say that and I think what you said, Charisse, is that right, Jim? Yeah. Didn't quite, I may not have said this exactly, but one of the things seems to hint at there is around, obviously, performance review. So I would advocate, actually, that there needs to be some consideration. If the organization is saying this is a strategic priority, if they're saying these are our values, I do think it should and must inform part of the performance process or review process as we grow. Now, we have to give people opportunities, right? We have to provide people with opportunities to learn. This should not be set up in a way that it's a punishment, because if it's a punishment system, people will just back away. But if an organization wants to truly live the values and is willing to support people so that they learn about unconscious bias, we learn about how we create inclusive environments and team-based, then I think we do need to hold ourselves accountable. And I'll give it an example. One thing that I'll say the university has changed in recent years for out of scope employees is, of course, that we are to comment back on in regards to annually how we live the values that are in the strategic plan, and a lot of those link to EDI and indigenization. In our own faculty, of course, we have certain prescriptions around what needs to be in performance reviews and that type of thing, but we're talking in our faculties around, here are our values and how do we live it and how do we create supports to be able to do that. So for me, it's less about punishing anybody. It's actually about providing and investing in everyone and holding us all accountable so that we live those values that we espouse. So I don't know, Therese, if that completely answers, but I would say around performance review, but I do firmly believe that an organization needs to invest in education, needs to invest in support, needs to invest in leadership development opportunities. It isn't enough to simply say, we have these values. If you don't live them, you're going to be punished for it.
Any thoughts on that, Laura Lee?
Yeah, I'll just piggyback a little bit off of what Gina said, and kind of alluding to that punishment piece, but it just made me think about the difference between having a growth mindset and a performance mindset when it comes to some of these things. And I think oftentimes performance evaluations do come across as, you've achieved this or you haven't, rather than how are you growing, how are you learning, how are you changing, as more of an evolutionary concept. And, I certainly don't have the answers to any of that, but I do think the intent that we approach those with really does shape the culture of the organization. And what does that look like in terms of people progressing towards higher, more deeper internalized forms of understanding of these things? And what does that, how is that different from, again, a tick box item, and moving away from some of the tokenistic things that we see and we know aren't working? So that's just one thing that I would maybe just add to what Gina had to say.
And Jim, if it's okay, I'll come back, just kind of building on Laura Lee, if that's all right.
Oh, yeah.
And thinking about, I'll say the example of performance review in regards to where do we start? Well, it can start around those growth conversations that Laura Lee has said as a part of performance review, right? I always have conversations around thinking about development and areas of improvement, or how we can invest. And that can be part of a conversation that's around growth as a starting point. That doesn't have to be even moving to the point of, okay, somebody must do this, or here are the consequences. And yeah, I know we're not moving fast enough on many of these things, but we also have to start from a place where we create opportunities for people and invest in people so that they can engage in a way, in a meaningful way, where they feel where they can learn.
So Kelly's thrown a question to me that I think is a really good how. Gina talked about the idea of kind of these, of listening tours and seeking out people's experiences. I promise everybody on the call that I'm just as square as I come across on screen. So I'm maybe particularly acute that it's hard to set these conversations up in a good way, right? And I'm wondering, Gina, if you've done more of these than I have, how is it you can have that happen in a good way? And how does it go beyond kind of a conventional 360? Like, what do we need to add to make sure those conversations can happen?
Yeah, Jim, if I understand correctly, question is around the notion of how do we engage in perhaps some of these tough conversations, or if we're talking about individuals who might represent a designated equity group, how do we engage without people feeling like, oh, you're calling me out? So a couple of things I will say is, I mean, you can approach this in a very intentional way, whereby, it's very clear that what your intent is, right? We're moving forward in regards to, how will I say this? That you could do it in one way where you reach out to individuals to say, I want to hear what's on your mind. I mean, here's what I might suggest, is I think one way to do this, first way to do it, is perhaps setting up a working group of some, whereby people can step forward or volunteer to be a part of a conversation that might be around EDI, or it might be around something perhaps even more specific to a particular equity deserving group. And in that way, it allows people who are in a place where they feel comfortable to be able to step forward and to have their voice shared, and you can hear from them on their terms. Now, of course, with that, some people will say, well, you're assuming that everyone will feel comfortable, and people get lost in that as well. Well, what I would hope, and what I have seen, similarly when we see affinity groups that are set up, is that There are ways to be able to tap into other people's voices once we have those working groups in place, once we have those conversations set up whereby it is the people for whom we are trying to support or change our workforces are able to speak on the terms that are appropriate for them. So that would be one thing. And I'll say that that has worked for me, right? In regards to working groups. So I have to be very intentional as to who possibly I might ask to lead it. And then allow people to step up if they want to be a part of those conversations. There are also other ways to do it that are a bit more anonymous, which would be, of course, depending on how large your workforce is, it may or may not be all that anonymous. But in regards to surveys, but again, as I said, I think we do have to be cautious, because if there is one racialized woman, or appears to be one racialized woman in a unit, then of course it's going to be very difficult for that person to feel like, oh, I'm being asked in an anonymous survey, but really it's going to be very clear who I am. The other thing I am going to say, though, and I hope I'm right on this, and I hope those people who have worked with me feel that way, that I think a lot of it also comes from having trusting relationships, Jim, and building those relationships with people, so that people, when you engage, know that you're, even if you get it wrong, Jim, right? So even if I get it wrong, I hope that the most people who surround me either feel comfortable enough to tell me I've got it wrong, or actually know that I'm coming from a place whereby I genuinely do want to know, how can we do this better? How can we do this differently, so that actually those perspectives are heard and valued, and what do we do moving forward to do things differently? I'll hand it over to maybe Laura Lee.
Well, Jeannie, you just read my mind about the trusting relationships piece. That was what I was jotting down as you were writing, and just how critical that is in terms of creating the environments that these conversations can even occur. Because if people don't feel that they can trust the individuals involved in the process, trust the process itself, that something meaningful is going to be coming out of it, I think it's very hard to get that engagement. And it's so quick to, I mean, we can damage that trust so fast, right? And so I do think that that's, you know, a lot of this stuff is about relationship building, and we're not always good about that because we often don't think we have the time. You know, we're busy. So people kind of rush into a meeting, or they rush at something. It's like, I've got a to-do list and I've got to do this and that. And they barely stop to say hello, let alone, you know, find out how people are and learn about people and their experiences. And, you know, I think somehow we have to make that a priority if we want to see movement in this space. And I think it's going to have spill-offs into a lot of other things as well.
So this is a great question. I had promised no hardballs when we were talking this, but this is a very difficult question. I don't mean it in a hardball way, but it's also a difficult incident. So I'm going to anonymize, if you don't mind, the question asker here. So it comes out of a context where someone in a different public service, so not Saskatchewan, had shared a story about an ADM talking about when she first started in her public service career, being told to, quote, check her indigeneity at the door, unquote. And that's shockingly blunt, right? That's something that is surprising, that we'd like to believe happens in a previous age, probably still does. But it's also true that happens implicitly. And especially if it's about groups that aren't at the senior leadership table, or that perhaps we don't think of as particularly disadvantaged groups, or are only having discussions around, right? I'd say discussions around trans identity or around mental health are kind of in that liminal area. How can we start to think about the implicit ways in which we're sending those messages to people who, you know, we don't have a representative at the senior leadership table or aren't part of established discussions around inclusion?
Laura Lee, I'm going to let you start on this one.
I mean, I think this is a great, powerful question, right? And it does get to the heart of, when I talked about that awareness piece, like how aware are we of these things? And do we even see them? And I would argue that many times we don't even see them. And I had the opportunity in some of my consulting work to do some interviews around experiences of racism. And honestly, as I sat and I listened to those conversations and people telling me their stories, there were things left and right that I'm like, I never would have thought of that. I never would have thought of that. And I think the only reason or the only way that we become more aware of these things is to have those conversations, and to try to gain insight into what people's experiences are, and so that we can become more able, I guess, to notice them, more sensitive to them. That I think is key. And I don't know, I mean, we can take courses and things like that, but nothing kind of takes the place of conversation and relationship. And I think as you build those relationships, then it stirs something inside you, because those become your friends. Those are your friends. And it's like, these things are happening to your friends, and like, that's not okay. And I think that starts to create a very different level of personalization around this. And I think that that's what it takes to internalize some of this stuff and start to make it come to life a little bit. So that only touches like a little bit of what was talked, but that's some of the initial thoughts I had. And I might have more, but Gina can take it from here.
Yeah, I mean, it's an incredibly tough question, because of course, one has to first move past the shock of the initial part of that, Jim, in regards to, what was said. Starting in that kind of context, one makes, should you run in the other direction, kind of thing. But if we talk about the implicit pardon, and I think it is hard actually on the implicit side. I mean, it's one of these things, it doesn't make it any better or worse when somebody is so explicit and you just think, okay, I know what I'm facing type of thing. And you just think, oh, is this the right culture for me or where I want to be, if one has choice, right? There's the thing, if it's that blatant in your face, it's sort of, if you have choice, and not everybody does have choice, is this a place where actually I want to work? Because clearly, would be difficult to have a sense of belonging and or uniqueness. I mean, that being valued in a context. In the sense of where the implicit comes in, it is really challenging. And I will say, I also, I struggle with this, and I know I don't always get it right myself. And thinking through with Laura Lee in regards to, the conversations. I mean, one of the things that comes to mind for me as we talk about cultures and how we move forward, or as leaders, what we can do, it makes me also think about how perhaps intentional we need to be around setting parameters. And if you just hold with me for a second, I don't mean parameters, what people can say, but more around how it is, the parameters around what do we consider respectable debate and conversation, and setting, I'll say parameters or in group discussions to say, okay, this is a conversation where people need to, we want to hear from everyone. The intent is not to actually shut down the conversations or be defensive or not respond. We're all here. We need to listen. We have another meeting where we come back and actually reflect on which of these initiatives we want to move forward. And so I think some of it comes back to, I think, us having parameters for ourselves and being mindful of that, but also for others in regards to the types of discussions we want to have to allow people to be able to have voice, so that they feel they can contribute, but also their individuality is appreciated in the organization. I think, of course, moving from that is, if at no point in time when people express their opinion do we ever move or take action on it, is of course another problematic aspect of it. But I think it is difficult. But for me, it's something I need to reflect on as well in regards to how we set up those conversations, and do we actually need to have parameters and clarity around how we're going to engage with each other, and the respect and how we move forward, so those diverse opinions can surface.
So there's a couple of really interesting threads running through the comments I'm going to try and pull together. And that is, I guess there's two of them that I'll try to pull together in one question. One is around decolonialization. So this big top line kind of societal discussion we're having that has implications, kind of in the Indigenous context inside Canada, but also in terms of what I call international decolonialization, right? So how do we think outside our Canadian box? That's a big top line discussion. How do we tie that into kind of practical on the ground practices and competencies and changes? And are there any lessons we can learn from, I think it's fair to say we started working on the gender aspect of this stuff earlier. Are there any lessons we can learn from that history as we move into this kind of newer discussion around decolonialization and listening to different voices?
Well, I'll start if that's okay with you. I mean, the first thing I want to say is I need to be very clear that I am not an expert on decolonization, and so keep that in mind. There's two comments I'll make. The first one is I think in respect to universities, and I think that probably the same thing can said, or some of the lessons around public sector. And then a second, my own personal insight from recently. One is in regards to this notion of internationalization and what that means and what it should mean, so to speak. That I think we have somehow morphed and modified and exploited a notion of internationalization away from, I would say, that notion of mutual respect, mutual learning, and challenging. I think I would argue that one of the great benefits of it would be about challenging Western perspectives that we have in place, as opposed to going back to this notion of assimilation. The second one, perhaps my second point, perhaps gets a little closer to the question, although again, I want to be very clear, I'm not the expert on decolonization. I am a learner as to how I might move forward as a leader. But I will say I'm participating right now in something in our faculty, a learning circle on decolonizing our curriculum. And something recently happened that I think was very powerful, and you might, I think perhaps I will have said it, but it didn't really get to me. I participated in blanket ceremonies, I participated in other ceremonies, very powerful. But one of the things that hit me very recently was a really profound sense of shame. Shame in the sense of having Indigenous people explaining and sharing their histories, their traumas, so that I, as a non-Indigenous white person, could learn and hopefully not repeat mistakes and ongoing harms moving forward. And I'll tell you why I felt shame. Because I felt shame that I had not taken, and despite me saying I am a learner, despite I'm trying to do more, I feel like I have not, and clearly have not, done enough, in the sense that we ask of Indigenous people to share with us those stories, expect so that hopefully we will have a light bulb moment and realize we need to be better, Jim. And so I don't think this actually answers the question. I don't think I'm an expert to be able to answer the question, but what I can say for me was that I had a moment recently whereby I looked very hard at myself and the expectations that I have of Indigenous people in regards to how we move forward in the future, and as a non-Indigenous person, how much more I need to do to educate myself, but also to be able to pave the way for Indigenous people to be able to highlight how it is we do need to make change for the future, not a non-Indigenous person.
Yeah, I think, this is not my area of expertise either. I'm learning, just like Gina said. And, I think one of the things that is key to be able to learn in this space. I go back to the concepts of humility and just recognizing how much we don't know. And, I'm constantly, I guess I don't know if I'm amazed or I don't know. I'm my own education, growing up in Saskatchewan, and, what we were taught and what we weren't taught. What are the omissions, what are the errors, what are the things that we're focused on, and just realizing what perspective that was taken. And I just find myself now questioning so many things, because it's like, well, gee, well, what about this angle? What about that angle? And I think that's good. I think we need to be able to be open to ask questions and to challenge things and learn and have that experience, that cognitive dissonance. One of the things with learning and development, we often talk about, in order to move to that next stage of learning, we have to get to a place of what we're using right now doesn't make sense to make sense of the world around us. The tools or the frameworks or the mindsets or the worldviews, somehow there's a conflict there, and that creates a cognitive dissonance and makes us uncomfortable. And we think, okay, we need something different, something better. And I guess, in a lot of this space, I would hope that, many of us kind of feel that, feel that cognitive dissonance, because I think that that's a positive. I think that that's that chance to kind of, it's an indication that growth is going to happen if we allow it to happen. And if we embrace that growth, and, kind of going to some of the concepts around, different worldviews and how it's different. I'm just going to relate it to some of the educational things. And as I started looking at, kind of that Western worldview and how that is shaped, and how colonialism has really shaped education, our systems, and how we approach it, and how we structure our classrooms, and how we approach teaching and learning. And when I did that, I mentioned in my talk that I did that session for our faculty back in February. And one of the things I did was compare and contrast kind of more those individualized forms of learning and approaches to teaching and learning versus more kind of collective, integrated mindsets and worldviews, and thinking about, how does our education, how would it look different if we approached it this way or that way, and things that we take for granted, because, we can't think outside the box if we don't first acknowledge the box. And we do all have boxes, we have boxes in terms of how we think and how we feel and how we view the world. And so if we can kind of step back and go, whoa, that's kind of a weird box. How did we get there? What do we know about that? And then start to kind of dismantle that box and construct it in different ways, I think then we'll really make progress. But you know what, that takes humility, and it takes a real willingness to do that and to overcome some of those fears. I think fears, maybe we're going to lose something, fears that, the system works pretty well for me. I've benefited from the system. What do you mean you want to start taking that apart? Those aren't easy things to overcome. And, I think we just have to keep talking.
Well, I want to push you on that one, Laura Lee, and I'll use it off the kind of the kind of question about gender and history, right? I think if we were to have this conversation about gender today, and I were to say something like, and focus just on gender, decolonialization is different, and it's separate experiences and separate histories, and I think a deeper critique. But if we were to have a conversation like this today, just on gender, and I were to walk away saying, gee, that was some really challenging conversation, and I sure hope I heard Gina and Laura Lee right, I will go away and ponder that. I think most folks on the call would be very grumpy with me, because that would be a very 1990 way to kind of, for someone like me, to close the conversation off. So I don't think there are direct lessons, but maybe lessons about scope of change and pace of change that we can learn from that older conversation or ongoing conversation about gender, right? When I look at the forces today, it's clear that we still have like massive amounts of work to do. It's ongoing, but I think we've been having it in the open and at the leadership level for longer.
Lorelei, do you want me to jump in for a minute on that?
Sure.
Yeah, a couple of things I'll say, Jim, in regards to, what have we learned from a gender side to kind of a larger discussion and how we move forward. I mean, a couple of things I'll say, and some of it build on what you're saying there. I mean, I would say that first, those who are leading organizations do not live these values, then we're not going to make any change. And I would also say, and I'll come to kind of the representation part. I see something in the chat, but we also, I would argue, need not apologize for making space, creating opportunities for those who are representatives of designated equity deserving groups. But we also can't do it alone. So not everyone is going to like it or appreciate it if you're in a leadership role, but we have to also empower others to live it. And now comes to the change part. Change takes time, and I think people are frustrated, and I don't mean to diminish how people are feeling, but people are tired of waiting, right? And I say we as a collective we, and that could be an individual we, it could be a particular group, but people are frustrated and tired, and for good reason. And here's what it goes back to the notion of representation matters, but it isn't enough. As organizations, we cannot expect to hire one visible minority or one Indigenous person and achieve change and even to get it right. I think we need to start somewhere, but the scale of change has to be far more significant than we have done. Because if we also look at, one might argue, yes, we've made progress when it comes to women in leadership roles, but I could argue on the other side of that is, for goodness, how long will it ever take for us to get there? And if that has to reflect, I'll say, as we look at other designated equity deserving groups, it's actually rather depressing. But here's what I will say, and this goes back to our organizations have to change. So not only who's in our organization, who's holding roles, our organizations have to change. Because if we are creating policies and opportunities to bring in racialized, visible minorities, people who represent visible minorities, racialized women, people with disabilities into our current systems, well, I can tell you right now, it is not going to work. So what we are going to have is that people who may have choice are going to come in and they are going to leave to go somewhere else. If they don't have choice, and they are stuck there, they will either be viewed as dissenting, difficult voices, or they will suppress their identity so that they can survive in our organizations and the structures that we have in place. Our practices, our systems have been designed, people have noted in the chat, from Western perspectives, and I would also argue from heterosexual and white privilege, that have been designed for a relatively homogeneous group. And if we do not change, it's not going to be easy. I don't have the answers. I have some ideas around it, which I've talked about the practices. But if we do not acknowledge that the systems and the organizations that follow those systems are not, if we don't recognize that they are flawed and they don't need to change, then we're not really going to make any, if I can say it, progress, if that's the right word or not, moving forward. So if we don't start looking at systemic bias, systemic practices that are problematic, then we will never get to this notion of equity and inclusion. We might get diversity in pockets, but we certainly will not get equity and inclusion. And that will be hard and is hard.
One of the things I'll just kind of add on to that, I'm just thinking out loud, in terms of how we create that momentum for change and where does that go? And I think about how valuable it is to create a picture for people of what is possible, what is different. And I think a lot of times people don't change because they don't know what they're changing to. What could that look like? So I think that part of what we do have to be able to do in organizations is to start to really conceptualize, well, what does different look like? You know, if these things are in place, if we, you know, have spaces where people feel included and belong, and equity is the norm, and diversity is embraced, well, what is that? What does that look like? What does it feel like? Can we visualize that in any way? And maybe we can't, but I would argue that there probably is examples out there that maybe we need to be able to draw on to start to create that forward momentum. Because, you know, I do think if we don't have a vision of where we want to go, that's very unsettling for many people. And status quo is going to be a very solid draw. We like our comfort zones, you know, so once you start pushing people, I use this model that, you know, we've got our comfort zone, our challenge zone, and our crisis zone. And where you see the biggest growth and movement and potential is in that challenge zone. So we're taking people a bit out of their comfort zone, but not putting them into all-out crisis. And I think, you know, in this space, oftentimes we really fluctuate between crisis and comfort. But it's like, what happens in that challenge zone? How do we get there? And I think that takes some real intentional thought and bringing people together, maybe, you know, around using design thinking principles or something like that to really start to think differently about some of these things. So just some of my thoughts on what it might take to create some momentum around change.
I think this is a fair point to bring in a question Robin had asked up earlier in the chat about how do you lead in this space or move towards EDI, lead from the middle, after an organization's suffered a setback, right? Whether it's a very public one or a kind of internal one where it just hasn't gone well, and it maybe hasn't gone well for any number of reasons. What does kind of recommitting and refreshing and getting people re-engaged in it look like? Sorry, that is a really hard question.
Yeah, and Jim, I mean, I'm completely comfortable with people sending a note or putting a chat saying, "Hi, how naive you are, Gina," when I say this. So I'm going to kind of expose myself in that way. But I'm going to say that as a leader or someone in a position of formal authority in an organization like that or a unit, I think you have to be willing to be vulnerable, Jim. And I would also argue, and this is not about taking responsibility, although I would argue that I think that is whoever that person is who's leading has to be humble and vulnerable and willing to take responsibility in regards to having a conversation around what do we learn from this? How do we move forward? How do we recommit to those values and moving forward and listen to people? And I think with that listening and providing forum, some people are going to be angry. Some people are going to be hurt. Some people are going to be disappointed. And I think some people are going to feel a sense of loss. And I think you have to create forums and space and time for people to be able to express that, so that you're able to work through that in regards to, and people being a part of then, how is it we move forward again, given what has happened? And I don't think that can necessarily be rushed, but I think it does have to be acknowledged fairly quickly after whatever the incident might be, because people, in some ways, it's a mourning, Jim, right? It's a mourning, but it also is about the notion of what do we learn from this? How do we move forward? And, you know, and being vulnerable in the sense that, you know, if it's me, I got it wrong. And I'm willing to try again if you're willing to have kind of invest your trust and your faith. But people need to be heard, and we need to hear why. Because Lorley was talking about before, that notion of a comfort zone doesn't make it right. But often what we will get is a defensive, right? And it is about trying to understand where that's coming from and listening. And rebuilding. So that may very well be a naive answer, but I base that on my own experience in regards to being vulnerable and accepting responsibility and providing forums for people to express their concerns, their feelings, their grief, their disappointment, and not actually closing down avenues so that you're dismissing people's how they're feeling and what they're experiencing.
Yeah, I'd really concur with what Gina said. And, you know, I'm thinking about some of the research that I've been doing around integrity, and in particular our new graduates' perceptions and conceptions related to integrity. And, you know, one of the things I'm thinking, just some of their comments about, you know, for them, they often talk about, you know, integrity doesn't mean perfection. They get that people are going to get things wrong and that people make mistakes. But where integrity came into play is, how do people respond to those mistakes? So if there is a whole bunch of defensiveness and deflection and kind of rationalization related to some of the things, that actually is a huge destroyer of trust. But if they see people stepping up and taking responsibility, acknowledging that this was a mistake, or we did it wrong, or we approached it wrong, or whatever the case may be, that goes a long way to kind of engaging people again. And I think the sooner that happens, the better. You know, a lot of the examples that we look at in my ethics class around companies where things have gone incredibly badly, and, you know, the response to that has huge implications in terms of how they're perceived in the future, and how quickly they respond, and how authentically they respond. And I think that, you know, again, that's an incredibly vulnerable place to be. And when you're we don't like dealing with hurt and disappointment, and, you know, none of us do. It's uncomfortable and it's hard, and but somehow that's what it's going to take. And you know, that's where I think, like, competencies, you know, so many times the leadership competencies that we thought were so valuable in the past, you know, in more of the authoritarian ways and things like that, again, that comes to a lot of our Western views of leadership and what that looks like and what we expect. But I think we need different leadership in many spaces going forward to be able to do this kind of work well. So yeah, that's just kind of some of my thoughts.
Susanna asks a question, I think, that kind of ties into this. You folks have loaded a lot on empathy today as kind of the leadership solution. And I've got to admit, early in my career, one of the reasons I think I became an academic was I didn't have to worry all that much about feelings. That changes once you start working with other people, but I was really quite happy to hide in the library. How do we screen for empathy in leadership? How do we encourage people to develop it? How can we make this something we're spending time to learn how to do well?
Do you want me to start, Lorelei, or did you?
Sure. You start. Yeah. I'm thinking.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, a couple of things, and then maybe Lorelei will come in, and I'll have something that might be a better response, Jim. So I'll kind of start from here. You know, I'd like to think I am highly empathetic, and that notion of trying to see from someone else's perspective, or asking where they come from. And of course, I have served as a leadership consultant. I teach leadership classes, and I remember in talking about emotional intelligence, trying to think through, okay, if somebody isn't empathetic, how do you actually develop that? How do you figure that out? How do you develop that kind of thing? And I think there's a couple of things I will say. You know, I think that, and this is going to sound like a sell job, and it's not meant to at all, but there are actually a couple of useful leadership tools out there. So there's EQI assessments out there, and they are flawed, like all kinds of assessments. But there are some actually that have been really helpful. You can do it as a self-assessment and/or 360. The self-assessment, of course, is your perception, but I would still argue have been actually very enlightening as a development tool in identifying kind of certain aspects. So that would be one of the things. And having, you know, somebody, whether it's your manager or coach, if you're fortunate enough to be able to have someone to have a conversation with you about talking through some of that to give you some sense. But the other thing that I would also say is a couple maybe intentional practices would be, one is actually not, Lorraine talked about this earlier, is actually in a meeting, if somebody raises something that seems to be different or in disagreement to what you have said, is to actually practice listening and not talking, and not responding, and actually a tactic whereby sometimes you go in, and I even sometimes will start a meeting to say, I did one recently to say, my intent with this meeting is not to have answers. I know you have lots of questions. There's things on your mind. I need to hear what's on your mind. And I will come back, to be able to address. And I say that as a practice, and you might say, what does that have to do with empathy? Because it means I'm trying to listen, Jim, and I'm actually trying to reflect, as opposed to feeling like I need to have all the answers or even be defensive. So that would be one tactic I would say that people, and sometimes if we step away, we reflect on it, we actually can see it a bit differently. The other thing that I would also, I've lost it. I had another one I was going to suggest as well. So I don't know, maybe Laura Lee can jump in with a couple of others. Oh, I know what it is, Jim. I think, and again, it takes courage. It takes having a bit of a tough shell, because it's one of these things that and I've learned it sometimes the hard way, and sometimes it's been a good lesson for me, is, don't ask a question if you're not prepared for getting an answer that you don't necessarily like. And I think that would be another thing, is to actually prepare yourself for, if you want feedback, if you want to understand where someone else is coming from, because that's really, I would say, one of the critical parts of empathy, is we first have to understand where somebody else is coming from. That old saying of you have to walk in somebody else's shoes. Well, if actually you don't listen and hear where they're coming from and create some sort of safe conversation where people can give you that opportunity, if you don't, that to me is the first step in regards to empathy, and trying to develop empathy. It doesn't mean that that alone is enough to be able to develop the understanding. But if you don't do that as an initial step, then I would say you're not going to be able to then kind of say, oh, I can kind of see where they're coming from. Oh, I didn't quite understand where that was coming from before. So I'll hand it over to you, Laura Lee, who might have some additional insights.
That's funny that you said insights, because insight is what I just wrote down. I think that really that is, the goal of empathy. And if you can frame it in a way, if empathy is something that you kind of feel uncomfortable with, if you feel like it's kind of a mushy, fluffy concept and it's all about feelings and emotions, then frame it as, I just want to understand, I want to develop insight. I need to get to the bottom of this. I want to try to understand as much about this person, this experience as I can. So if you frame it as, again, kind of a learning goal, right? To be able to do that, sometimes it makes it a little bit, maybe less intimidating if that's not your kind of mode of operation typically. And, and then over time, it becomes a little bit more natural to kind of have these kind of conversations. But, again, depending on what your context has been, many people aren't comfortable having kind of feeling type conversations, right? They've been very intellectual, they've been very cognitive. So kind of that, I always say, that distance from our head to our heart, like, in tangible terms, it's not very far, but realistically, it can be massive, right? And I think that, whatever it takes to kind of take those steps, and just, again, recognizing that and acknowledging that and framing it and using language that kind of can work in that context, in that environment, I think can be great ways to kind of start to navigate that.
I think, I know that leadership development is an industry. Like all industries, it's got upsides and downsides, but I have myself taken some comfort over the years that these are competencies you get better at, right? You can choose to develop them. Whether our models of leadership, I'd say, reinforce that or not is a different question, different one. I think that there's still like a lot of great discussion we could have here in the chats, but we're at time. So I'll pick one last question, and I think it's a good one. That is, there's a lot of pressure to just produce output, to just have quantity in all sorts of different organizations. Focusing on quality, focusing on relationship is difficult, and it pulls you away from that. And is there a question, if we're committed to EDI, do we need to think about what the organization as a whole is trying to do or trying to be, and how can we reframe that purpose question?
Yeah, Jim, I would agree that we do have to. I'm going to frame it from two sides. One, you may not necessarily like. I think that many leaders right now, leading through COVID in particular, leading through kind of these perilous times, are in very difficult situations in the sense that they have the organizational imperative and the relationship. And I think what COVID has shown us is that actually when there aren't relationships in place, or if you don't actually commit to it and do it in different ways, that actually we're in a lot of trouble as an organization. So I think it is very difficult. And I can say from my own experience that I hope that those that who surround me know that relationships matter. But I will say, every other week I fall into it in the sense that notion of, okay, I don't have time for another meeting. I don't have time for another conversation. I just need to get on with something. One of the things I did for myself a number of years ago was try to reframe. I always thought meetings were such a waste of time. I couldn't get things done. I needed to get back to what I was supposed to be doing. And I reflected on that over time and thinking about my bizarre notion of productivity, right? And so if I were in a meeting, it wasn't productive, and I had all these other things to do. And I've learned over time the notion that those conversations are productive. Those conversations, if we think about productivity in a very different way, they are about building relationships and trust and ideas. So I do fundamentally think that we have to, and I think as an organization, if we don't slow down to speed up in regards to EDI and I, that we're doomed to fail, Jim. I mean, we are failing in many ways already. But if we don't, and I don't have a solution around it, I'm not, I'm leading a unit, I'm not leading a university. And so if someone who's watching, they get easy for you to say, but what I can say is that when times are tough, or if we want to have transformational change, that if we do not have, and we have not invested in relationships and conversations, we're dead in the water.
Yeah, I would 100% agree with that. And I think we have to get away from this notion that, it's always about bigger and faster and more and more and more and more, right? Like we see that in so many aspects of our society, with consumerism and the speed with which we expect things to be done, and kind of constantly feeling like I gotta be on, I gotta be, available. I have to respond to this email. I have to do all these things. And I think that, we kind of become hamsters on a wheel, right? Like we're just running and running and running without kind of stepping back and saying, just a second, what are we doing here? What is truly important? And I think one of the things that we did, Gina talked a little bit about COVID, and we've learned a lot from COVID, right? Like as a society and as a global society, we've learned, we've discovered a lot of flaws in our systems. We've discovered how interconnected we truly are. We've discovered how important relationships are and which relationships are important to us. We've discovered how much we do need other people to be in our lives and come alongside us, and that we can't do it alone. But we also know that we can't do it all the time. And, I think just a simple example from even teaching, I think there's sometimes this pressure. It's like, okay, my students have to know all this stuff, and I'm going to throw as much at them in this class as, in this next 90 minutes, they're going to go away with. And it's like, you know what, the more I scale it back, the more my students learn. The more I give them the opportunity and the space to process what we're talking about and think about it and come to their own solutions, it's very different than if I'm just standing up there trying to transmit knowledge to them. You know, Gina mentioned the whole idea of transformation, and I think that transformation requires us to be able to take the time to digest stuff and process it and make meaning of it and make sense of it, and then it starts to move us. And if we never give ourselves this time, if we don't give our staff and our colleagues and our students time to do that, we aren't going to get that transformation. We're going to get a lot of burnout. We're going to get a lot of frustration. We're going to get people digging their heels in, going back to their comfort zones, trying to stay in status quo, because honestly, that takes the least amount of energy, right? It takes energy to do some of these things. And so, I think that's, sometimes we do have to go slow in order to ultimately go fast down the road. And I think that's critical.
Thank you both. And thank you for sharing the insights for the discussion, and much more than usual, even I'd like to thank the audience. I think the questions in the chat, I know I didn't get to them all, but I really hope it felt like you drove the discussion, because it was an interesting one, and I tried to follow where you were going. Just before I ask for a big round of huzzahs and whatever those other little things on Zoom are, just a couple of announcements about upcoming events. In terms of program information sessions, we've got one for our Masters of Governance Entrepreneurship in Northern and Indigenous Communities on the 1st of December, and then one for the MPA on the 17th of January coming up. Our last CSIP forum, so Center for Science and Innovation Policy, will be on the 2nd of December. We'll be joined by Dr. Garrett Richards talking about bridging science, policy, community, and more, cases of transdisciplinarity from climate change. And then on the 8th, we'll have a McPherson talk, which is hosted by the Canadian Centre for the Study of Cooperatives. Guest speaker Carol Henry will be talking about scaling up pulse varieties in southern Ethiopia for sustainability and improved food security. Clearly, I am out of talking for the day. So let us say thank you to Gina and Laura Lee. I'm grateful to them, and it was a really wonderful afternoon. Thank you.